everyone. I'm Jocelyn Duff, co-founder and executive director of Cure CMT4J, our research nonprofit that we founded after our daughter Talia was diagnosed with the ultra-rare disease CMT4J. We've been on a path toward a gene therapy for several years now, and I know how much work goes in behind the scenes in order to get to treating that first patient. One of the earlier encounters is an FDA meeting called the Pre-IND meeting. And to help us learn more about the Pre-IND meeting today and all of the necessary behind the scenes work is Claire Marasco. She's the Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs at Forge Biologics. And Claire has been working in this space for a long time.
Yes, hi everyone. As Jocelyn mentioned, I've been working in cell and gene therapy regulatory affairs for almost 10 years now, and have had the opportunity to support over 20 US gene therapy programs through preclinical and clinical regulatory applications. I'm very passionate about coming up with innovative regulatory strategies to get safe therapies to patients quickly. These strategies can be established early in development, including in that pre-IND meeting.
Thanks, Claire. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the pre-IND meeting and why should patients and patient groups care about it?
Absolutely. So, an FDA pre-IND meeting is a conversation held between a company and the FDA before the drug goes into clinical trials. So, if you split up the name a little bit, an IND stands for Investigational New Drug. This is the official request that the company sends the FDA to start that clinical trial. So, the pre-IND means that it occurs before that request for a clinical trial starts. So at this meeting, the company comes to the FDA to talk about its new drug and its plans to test it. They usually talk about the manufacturing plans, any lab or animal studies that have already been completed, how the first human study will work, and what safety tests are needed to make sure that it's okay to go into humans. From a company's perspective, the meeting also helps to make sure that they're on the right track before they spend a lot of time and money. At a pre-IND meeting, the FDA can help pinpoint any missing information required for that IND application, suggest better study designs, and explain what's needed to start clinical trials. A pre-IND meeting matters to patients and their families because it helps make sure new medicines are tested safely and carefully before people receive them. This is done by ensuring that enough safety testing has been done in animals to understand the drug and reduce any risks for patients in clinical trials. It can also help a clinical trial start sooner by catching any issues and fixing those problems ahead of time and identifying everything needed for that IND application. This is the first review of the clinical study design too, so the FDA will give feedback to make sure that that drug has the potential for success in its clinical trials so that the therapy can stay on the market for patients and families.
That sounds like a lot. Can you explain a little bit more about what goes into preparing for the pre-IND and what the research team does behind the scenes?
Yeah, definitely. We can break it down a little bit. Excuse me. At a high level, the research team has to show a couple of things. So, one, that it looks safe enough to move forward to human testing. So, usually companies will come with a little bit of safety data from their existing animal studies, but importantly, they are typically planning for a large toxicology study, often called a pivotal or IND enabling toxicology study. And the FDA reviews the plans for that study to show that it will have the right safety data to support a clinical trial in humans. The criticality of that data, plus the fact that these studies can take a long time and be very expensive, makes it really important to get the design right. Second, the FDA wants to see evidence that this drug might work in humans. At a pre-IND meeting, again, they'll have those lab and animal studies, sometimes conducted in cells, animals, or other models, that show that the therapy could provide that benefit. The third thing is the company wants to demonstrate that they have plans to reliably manufacture their product. Usually, these plans are discussed in detail with the FDA, and this includes discussing any differences between the material used in the previous animal studies and the material intended for patients. And then finally, there is a thoughtful plan for the first clinical trial that is presented to the agency, and the FDA reviews this clinical study design to let the sponsor know if they believe it will do a good job in keeping patients safe and testing if the therapy works in people.
Okay. So I feel like I always hear the phrase early and often from the FDA. Can you explain how the research teams can interact with the FDA in the planning phases of a clinical trial, and why are these interactions so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been talking about the pre-IND meeting. This is the biggest and most well-known milestone, but the teams can also talk to the FDA using an interact meeting or a Type D meeting all before filing that IND application. So an interact meeting is a really early stage conversation with the FDA. Usually it's done in the early research stage to get feedback on initial lab studies, discuss preliminary manufacturing plans, identify potential safety concerns, or understand what additional data the agency might need. It's usually used for therapies that have new technologies, either in the therapy itself, like some editing technologies, or during its manufacturing. Overall, it's an early check to make sure the development plan is right on track before any major studies or manufacturing begins. Then the other meeting, the Type D meeting, is used when there's a really specific question or focused topic that needs to be answered by the FDA so that research teams can move forward with development. Type D meetings often result in a written response from the agency, but sometimes a live meeting is held to discuss the question if it's really complex. This is a good way to overcome roadblocks you encounter during development.
Claire, do you have an example of a Type D meeting?
Yeah, so in my position, especially at Forge, I see a lot of developers that might tweak their manufacturing process and make changes after they've already conducted their animal studies. So in this case, the research team needs to prove that the products with the old manufacturing process and the new one are comparable. So they'll make a study design to demonstrate that comparability, and they can bring it to the FDA with a Type D meeting to show that they intend to make comparable products and that the new process can make your clinical material. So overall, for these meetings, on the company side, the interactions are usually coordinated by a regulatory affairs team, and the regulatory affairs team then will point to other experts on the team in clinical trials, manufacturing, and preclinical studies to address any of the questions that the FDA asks or wants to discuss. I've also seen many companies include patient voices as part of their pre-IND meetings or other regulatory meetings. And it really helps to set the stage with the community's perspective on the therapy for the FDA. These have been some of the most impactful moments of my career, and it always gives people on both sides of the table really important reminders of the ultimate goal of the meeting, which is to get a safe and effective therapy to patients as quickly as possible. So,
Absolutely.
patient groups are a hugely important piece of the pre-IND phase in many ways. So, Jocelyn, I want to turn back to you. From your perspective, what do you think are some of the other meaningful ways that patients can contribute?
Well, a big piece of the pre-IND is the playbook or the protocol, I think, for the plan for a clinical trial. And so the FDA wants to see that there is actually a plan in place, that the research group understands the disease and the patient population. How many patients do we know of or estimate there to be? What are those demographics? And what measures are most important to track in this particular patient population? So, in a phase 1/2 trial, safety is, of course, the primary endpoint, but the researchers will want to identify secondary endpoints as well to ultimately be able to show efficacy, ways in which to show that the gene therapy is actually working. Patient groups have a crucial role to play in all of this, in helping to recruit patients for natural history studies and registries. And this happens hopefully long before the actual planning process for the clinical trial, so that those can help to inform the trial. Also, in helping to define those meaningful endpoints or the patient relevant outcomes that we want to look for in a natural history study and in the clinical trial, and in informing researchers about trial feasibility for patients and their families. So, what are the burdens and risks involved in the study and in any necessary travel to get there? We want to learn as much as we can in the early phases of a clinical trial, and researchers might tend to want to include every possible test and measurement, but that might not be feasible for patients and their families. So, patients and patient groups can provide invaluable insights into planning the clinical trial protocol. What is the burden and the risk to the patient? How much is too much? And also, what are the caregivers' needs in order to support patients during a clinical trial? Patient groups can also spearhead and organize patient-led meetings with the FDA. And this is a way to educate the FDA on their specific disorder, especially if it's an ultra-rare disorder that might not be very well known. This can help the FDA to better understand their disease, how it presents and progresses, what might be important to include in the clinical protocol, or why a certain trial design might make more sense to researchers to use. Some examples of these patient-led meetings are patient listening sessions and externally led patient-focused drug development meetings, or PFDDs. That was a lot. We covered a lot there, Claire. Is there anything else that you think we should share or anything else that you forgot to mention?
Yeah, we sure did. I think we covered a good bit, but I'd like to refer the patient communities to the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium's regulatory playbook. There are a lot more details and examples of regulatory interactions in the playbook, spanning from interact meetings through IND application. There are also some resources on designations like orphan drug designation that can give teams some incentives for developing a therapy. The road to clinical trials can be long and complex, but hosting productive early interactions with the agency can clarify so much to get patients the therapies that they need.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you.